This was the life of a steelworker in the USA. In 1962, the steel industry killed and injured its workers at a rate that would be considered a national emergency today, and nobody called it one. The open hearth furnaces running inside places like U.S. Steel's Gary Works in Indiana, Bethlehem Steel's plant in Sparrows Point, Maryland, and the mills lining the Monongahela River Valley south of Pittsburgh reached internal temperatures of nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Molten steel is not a material that forgives mistakes. A splash of liquid metal the size of a quarter landing on exposed skin causes a third-degree burn in less than a second. An explosion triggered by water trapped in a ladle could send fragments of iron traveling at the speed of rifle rounds across a production floor the size of a city block. And yet, in 1962, approximately 500,000 Americans went to work inside those buildings every single day, on rotating shifts that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The steel industry was not merely an important sector of the American economy in 1962. It was the spine of the entire industrial civilization that the United States had built since the Civil War. Every car, every bridge, every appliance, every skyscraper, every aircraft carrier, every oil pipeline, every railroad rail in the country had passed through a mill like the ones these men worked in. What was it like to be one of those 500,000? What did a man actually do, hour after hour, inside a building where the air itself seemed to be on fire? The Gary Works, operated by United States' Steel Corporation on the southern shore of Lake Michigan in Gary, Indiana, was by 1962 one of the largest industrial facilities ever constructed by human beings anywhere on Earth. Its production floor stretched for 7 miles along the lakeshore. It contained multiple blast furnaces, each standing over 100 feet tall, that ran continuously, never shutting down, never cooling, operating around the clock every day of the year because the cost of heating a blast furnace, back up from cold, was prohibitive enough that it was cheaper to keep them running forever. Thousands of workers moved through the plant on overlapping shifts. They arrived at one of 22 locker rooms, changed into work clothes, collected their protective gear, and traveled, sometimes on company buses running the length of the facility, to wherever their particular job was located. The scale of the place was disorienting to anyone encountering it for the first time. The noise was continuous and physical, a combination of machinery, moving steel, gas combustion, and the deep rhythmic thudding of rolling mills that workers described as something you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. Men who spent careers inside Gary Works or the Homestead plant outside Pittsburgh often said that the mill became a second world, more real in some ways than the neighborhoods they drove home to at the end of a shift, because the mill demanded everything and left nothing in reserve. Before we continue, comment below if you have ever worked in a dangerous job. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming content. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. The steel-making process in 1962 moved through several distinct and equally dangerous stages, each performed by workers who had spent years learning the specific hazards of their particular corner of the mill. At the blast furnace, iron ore, limestone, and coke, a refined form of coal, were fed continuously into the top of a structure that stood over 100 feet tall and reduced the raw materials to molten pig iron at the bottom through a sustained chemical reaction that burned at temperatures no human being could approach without shielding. The pig iron was tapped at intervals, flowing in glowing orange rivers through channels cut in the furnace floor into torpedo-shaped ladle cars that carried it to the steel-making furnaces. At the open hearth furnace, the dominant steel-making technology in American mills in 1962. The pig iron was refined into steel through a process that involved sustained exposure to temperatures approaching 3,000 degrees. Before the furnace was tapped and the liquid steel released into the ladle below, workers banged on the structural beams with tools to warn everyone in the vicinity to take cover. If moisture had gotten into the molds or the ladle, the reaction when the molten steel contacted it could be explosive, sending liquid metal in every direction across the production floor. There were no effective barriers between the workers and that possibility. There was training, experience, and the particular alertness that develops in men who have watched what molten steel can do to a human body. A steel mill in 1962 operated on a shift system that divided the day into 3 8-hour rotations running continuously: the day shift, the afternoon shift, and the midnight shift, called the graveyard turn. Each had their own crew, their own rhythms, and their own particular risks. Men rotated through the shifts on a schedule that changed weekly or bi-weekly, which meant that a steelworker's body never fully adjusted to any single sleep cycle. One week he was working days and home for dinner. The next he was starting at midnight and sleeping through the morning while his children were at school and his neighborhood went about its business around him. The physical demands of the work compounded the effects of the disrupted schedule. A worker at the open hearth furnace stood within radiant heat that could reach 300 degrees Fahrenheit at the work position, even with full protective gear, for hours at a stretch. The weight loss from sweating through a single shift in those conditions could run to several pounds of fluid. Men learned to drink enormous quantities of water and to recognize the early signs of heat exhaustion in themselves and their co-workers, because the alternative was passing out near equipment that would kill them if they fell into it. Protective gear in 1962 consisted primarily of heavy canvas or leather clothing, face shields, and gloves, nothing like the engineered flame-resistant materials that would eventually become standard. A man's protection depended heavily on how well he read the specific situation in front of him and how fast he could move when something went wrong. The community that formed around the steel mills of Pittsburgh, Gary, and Cleveland in 1962 was one of the most cohesive and internally structured working-class societies in American history. The mills had been drawing immigrant labor for generations, first from Ireland, then from Poland, Slovakia, Italy, Hungary, and the American South, where black workers had migrated north in large numbers during and after World War II, seeking the union wages that the steel industry offered. By 1962, the neighborhoods surrounding plants like Homestead, Braddock, and Clairton in the Monongahela Valley were multi-generational steel communities where a man's father and grandfather had very likely worked the same mill, possibly the same furnace. The social life of these communities organized itself almost entirely around the mill's schedule. Bars near the plant gates opened early to catch the men coming off the midnight turn. Churches scheduled their services around shift rotations. The elementary schools were full of children whose fathers all worked the same hours and whose families all understood, without it needing to be said, what it meant when a man came home from a shift looking more worn than usual, and what it meant when he didn't come home at all. The United Steelworkers of America was, in 1962, one of the most powerful labor unions in the United States. It represented approximately 500,000 workers in the basic steel industry and had secured, through decades of organizing and through one of the longest strikes in American industrial history, the 116-day steel strike of 1959, wages and benefits that placed steelworkers among the best compensated blue-collar workers in the country. A skilled steelworker in Gary or Pittsburgh in 1962 could earn between $4 and $5 an hour in base wages, with overtime pushing annual earnings well above the national median household income. The union had also won pension benefits, health insurance, and workplace safety grievance procedures that gave workers at least a formal mechanism to contest the most egregiously dangerous conditions. But the union's power and the wages it had won came with a specific relationship to the work itself. A man who wanted the pay accepted the conditions. The furnaces ran at 3,000 degrees, whether you were comfortable with that or not. The overhead cranes moved ladles of liquid steel across the production floor, whether you felt it was safe or not. You learned the risks, you learned how to manage them as best you could, and you went in. The long-term health consequences of working in a steel mill in 1962 were only partially understood at the time and were systematically understated by the industry. The coke ovens, the facilities that converted coal into the coke used as fuel in blast furnaces, produced a complex mixture of coal tar, benzene, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that blanketed the workers tending them in carcinogenic compounds with every shift. Studies conducted in subsequent decades would find that coke oven workers had significantly elevated rates of lung cancer, kidney cancer, and other malignancies compared to the general population. Workers in the blast furnace and open hearth departments inhaled iron oxide particles, silica dust, and metallic fumes on a daily basis across careers that routinely lasted 30 or 40 years. The asbestos used extensively throughout the mill for insulation, on pipes, on furnace walls, on the undersides of floors, was not yet understood to be the specific lethal hazard it would later be proven to be, and no one in 1962 was warning workers away from it. The occupational diseases that resulted from these exposures did not show up on the mill floor in the form of dramatic accidents. They showed up 20 years later in the lungs and livers of retired workers who had spent their careers doing exactly what the company asked them to do. The specific danger of working on the casting floor, where liquid steel was poured from ladles into ingot molds, was one that every steel worker understood viscerally from their first weeks on the job. The ladles themselves held anywhere from 50 to 300 tons of liquid steel at temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. They were transported by overhead crane, swinging through the plant on cables and hooks above the heads of workers on the floor below. A ladle failure, a crack in the refractory lining that allowed liquid steel to breach the containment, was a catastrophic event that could kill everyone within a wide radius before anyone could respond. The molds into which the steel was poured had to be absolutely free of moisture, because liquid steel contacting even a small amount of water produces an instantaneous steam explosion of tremendous force. Workers inspected the molds before each pour and cleared the area. But the pace of production in a competitive mill in 1962 created pressure to move faster than caution recommended. Men who raised safety concerns about a particular pour were heard out, and then the pour happened anyway because the furnace was ready and the ladle was full, and you could not put 300 tons of liquid steel back where it came from. By 1962, the American steel industry was approaching the crest of its post-war dominance, though few people inside the mills fully understood that. Production was high, employment was high, wages were the best in the industry's history, and the demand for American steel showed no obvious signs of weakening. What was happening beneath the surface was a technological shift that would take another decade to become fully visible. Japan and West Germany, rebuilding their industrial capacity from scratch after the devastation of World War II, were constructing mills around the new basic oxygen furnace process, which was faster, more efficient, and dramatically cheaper to operate than the open hearth technology that still dominated American production in 1962. American steel executives, sitting on profitable operations and preferring not to write off the enormous capital investment already sunk into their existing furnaces, were slow to adopt the new technology. The men working the open hearth furnaces in Pittsburgh and Gary in 1962 were operating equipment that was already technologically obsolete by the standards of what was being built in Osaka and Dusseldorf. They just didn't know it yet. The steel mills of America in 1962 were places of extraordinary productive power and extraordinary human cost. They made the physical infrastructure of the modern United States possible, and they extracted a price for doing so that was measured in burned hands, damaged lungs, ruined hearing, and the particular psychological weight that comes from working for 30 years in a place where the price of inattention is measured in seconds, and the consequences are permanent. The men who worked those mills built the middle class of the American industrial heartland, not as a byproduct of their labor, but directly through the wages the union had won and the stability those wages provided to families and communities built entirely around the sound of the mill. When the industry began its long collapse in the 1980s, when the plants in Braddock and Johnstown and Youngstown and Gary closed one after another, what disappeared was not just a set of jobs. What disappeared was a way of life that had organized the daily existence of millions of Americans for 3 generations, built on the premise that a man who was willing to stand close enough to 3,000 degrees of liquid fire for 30 years deserved, at the end of it, a pension and a house that was paid for. That premise turned out to be more fragile than the steel they made. The physical geography of the steel towns shaped everything about how their residents experienced daily life. In Pittsburgh, the mills sat in the river valleys, the Monongahela, the Allegheny, and the Ohio, and the smoke and particulate they produced filled the valleys and rose into the neighborhoods that climbed the hillsides above them. Before the smoke control ordinances that Pittsburgh enacted in the late 1940s and early 50s, the city had been famous for a darkness at midday caused by mill emissions so dense that streetlights were left on around the clock. By 1962, the air had improved, but the men inside the mills were still breathing the particulates directly at their source, hours per shift, year after year. In Gary, the mill dominated the northern edge of the city, running along the lakeshore, and the prevailing winds carried its emissions south over the residential neighborhoods where the workers lived. Children grew up in houses where the smell of the mill was as familiar as the smell of dinner cooking, a permanent background note of sulfur, coal smoke, and hot metal that people who grew up in those towns identified decades later as the specific smell of home. It was not a safe environment in any measurable sense. It was simply the environment that existed, and the families who lived in it adapted to it the way people adapt to any sufficiently permanent condition, by building a life around it rather than in spite of it. The rotating shift schedule that steel mills imposed on their workers in 1962 was not merely an inconvenience. Medical research conducted in subsequent decades would identify chronic shift work as an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, and a range of other conditions, effects that accumulated silently across the years of a career spent moving between day turns, afternoon turns, and midnight turns on a weekly rotation that gave the human body no stable pattern to adapt to. A steel worker in his 40s who had been rotating shifts since his early 20s had spent 2 decades in a state of controlled sleep deprivation and circadian disruption, without that condition ever being named or recognized as a workplace hazard. It was simply the schedule, and the schedule was what the furnaces required. Men managed it the way they managed everything else the mill imposed, by finding ways to function within it By learning what their body needed at each point of the rotation, and by not talking about the parts that didn't work. The culture of the mill, like the culture of most dangerous male workplaces in 1962, had a limited vocabulary for complaint and an extensive vocabulary for endurance. A man who could not handle the heat, the hours, the noise, and the specific psychological weight of working every day in proximity to forces that could kill him instantly was not the kind of man the mill had use for. The men who stayed, and most of them stayed for decades, developed a particular pride in that endurance. Not in spite of what the mill demanded from them, but because of it. It was not a healthy relationship with a workplace. It was, for a generation of American men, the only relationship with work that made sense of who they believed themselves to be.